The Aurora Grand Ballroom in Seattle, Washington, shimmered under the glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, each one casting a cascade of light that danced across the polished mahogany floors. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the city's elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hope Gala, an event designed to raise funds for a new orphanage and support center for displaced youth. The air was thick with the scent of lavender perfume roasted lamb and the faint tang of aged champagne sipped from flutes that cost more than most people's weekly wages. 200 guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns moved through the room with the effortless grace of those accustomed to power. Their laughter was bright but brittle, a symphony of self-assured privilege that echoed off the gilded walls. Conversations buzzed about stock portfolios, yacht purchases, and the latest real estate ventures, each voice competing to be heard over the delicate clink of silverware. At the heart of it all stood Alexander Reed, a 42-year-old investment banker whose sharp jawline and sharper wit made him the unofficial king of the evening. His charcoal gray suit, custom-made in Milan, hugged his frame perfectly, and his smile was a weapon charming when he wanted it to be cutting when he didn't. As chairman of the gala's fundraising committee, Alexander reveled in the spotlight, shaking hands and tossing off quips that drew appreciative chuckles from his peers. To him, this event was less about the children it claimed to help and more about cementing his status among Seattle's wealthiest. He had doubled the donations from last year's gala, a feat he mentioned at every opportunity, and he basked in the glow of his own success. The room in turn orbited around him, each guest eager to bask in his reflected glory. Into this meticulously curated world stepped a man who did not belong. He appeared at the grand archway, a solitary figure in a threadbare brown coat that looked like it had been salvaged from a thrift store dumpster. His boots, scuffed and caked with the faint dust of Seattle's streets, left smudges on the pristine floor, each mark a silent rebellion against the room's opulence. His gray hair was tangled, falling just past his ears, and a patchy beard framed a face carved with deep lines, lines that spoke of years spent weathering storms, both literal and figurative. His hands, rough and calloused, clutched a battered violin case, its leather cracked and peeling. The man, whose name was James Carver, stood still for a moment, his pale green eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. He was not nervous, though his posture suggested a slight hesitation, as if he were measuring the weight of the moment. The chatter in the ballroom faltered, heads turning as the guests registered the intrusion. Eyes that were accustomed to appraising diamonds and designer labels now narrowed in confusion and disdain. Who let him in? A woman in a sapphire gown whispered, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She clutched her diamond-encrusted clutch as if the man's presence might contaminate her wealth. Security. Another voice called, this one belonging to a portly man in a velvet blazer, his face flushed from too much wine. The word rippled through the crowd, a command wrapped in indignation. James took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots echoing faintly in the sudden hush. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and gravelly, weathered by time and hardship. It was not loud, but it carried slicing through the murmurs like a blade. "I don't mean to interrupt. I saw the music set up, and I was wondering, could I play the violin for a plate of food?" The request hung in the air, absurd in its simplicity, unthinkable in its audacity. For a moment, there was only silence, as if the room itself couldn't comprehend the words. Then Alexander Reed threw back his head and laughed, a sharp barking sound that was equal parts amusement and contempt. The laughter spread, a wave of mockery washing over the room as guests took their cue from the man they all aspired to impress. "Play the violin," Alexander said, stepping forward, his polished shoes gleaming under the chandelier light. You, in that coat. What's next? Asking to borrow my Rolex for a quick pawn. The crowd roared again, delighted by his cruelty. To them, James was not a person, but a prop, a momentary diversion from their champagne and canapes. A woman in a crimson dress leaned toward her companion, whispering loudly, "He probably stole that violin case from a street performer." Another guest, a tech mogul with a neatly trimmed beard, added, "I bet he doesn't even know how to hold it properly." Near the kitchen doors, a young waitress named Sarah Mitchell watched the scene unfold, her heart tightening in her chest. At 22, she was working 2 jobs to put herself through college studying social work with dreams of helping the city's forgotten. She recognized something in James's eyes, a quiet dignity, a resilience that reminded her of her older brother who had struggled with addiction and homelessness before finding his way. Sarah took a step forward, a tray of empty glasses balanced in her hands, intending to offer James a glass of water or a kind word. But the hotel manager, a wiry man named Harold Grayson, grabbed her arm. "Don't even think about it, Sarah," he hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward Alexander's table. "You get involved and you're out of a job? We don't need trouble with these people." Sarah froze her instinct to help warring with the reality of her precarious situation. She looked at James, trying to convey an apology with her eyes, but he was already turning back to the crowd, unfazed by their scorn. "Please," James said again, his voice steady despite the hostility. "I'm not asking for a handout, just a chance to play. 1 song for a meal. I haven't eaten properly in days." It was a calculated half-truth, designed to test the room's compassion or lack thereof. In reality, James had eaten a modest sandwich at a nearby diner that afternoon, but he needed to see how they would respond to a man they believed was desperate. The crowd's laughter grew louder, more vicious. Alexander, sensing an opportunity to cement his dominance, climbed onto a chair, his movements theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming across the ballroom, "we have a guest who thinks he can entertain us. A street musician, no less, gracing us with his talents." The word dripped with sarcasm, and the crowd chuckled obediently. "Here's the deal," Alexander continued, pointing at James. "You play us 1 song. If you can manage to get through it without making our ears bleed, I'll personally see to it you get a plate of food. But when you fail, and trust me, you will, you'll be out that door faster than you can say, 'Spare change.'" The crowd buzzed with excitement, relishing the cruelty of the game. They were spectators in a modern coliseum, eager to see the beggar humiliated. James didn't flinch. His eyes, calm and piercing, settled on the small stage at the center of the room, where a sleek music stand and a microphone had been set up for the evening's scheduled performers, a string quartet currently on a break. He walked toward it, his steps slow but purposeful, the violin case swinging lightly at his side. The crowd parted reluctantly, their whispers a mix of mockery and curiosity. $5 says he drops the bow. Before he plays a note, a man in a pinstripe suit called out, prompting another round of laughter. "I'll take that bet," another replied, "but I say he doesn't even know how to tune it." James reached the stage and set his case on the floor, opening it with a care that seemed almost reverent. Inside was a violin, old, but meticulously maintained its wood, worn but polished to a soft sheen. He lifted it gently, as if it were an extension of himself, and tucked it under his chin. The bow, equally worn but steady in his hand, hovered over the strings. The room grew quieter, the anticipation shifting from amusement to something else, something uncertain. "Careful with that instrument," Harold Grayson squeaked from the sidelines, wringing his hands. "It's not one of ours, but you break it. You're paying for it." The warning drew a few chuckles, but James ignored it. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the room's hostility wash over him like a wave he had long learned to withstand. When he opened them, his gaze was fixed on Alexander, who was still standing on his chair. Arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face. "What'll it be?" Old man Alexander called. "Some nursery rhyme you picked up from a street corner?" The crowd snickered, but James didn't respond. Instead, he drew the bow across the strings, producing a single clear note, a low, resonant G that filled the ballroom with a purity that silenced the laughter. The sound was not loud, but it was perfect, vibrating with a depth that seemed to reach into the bones of everyone present. For 5 seconds he held the note, letting it linger like a question posed to the room. When he lifted the bow, the silence that followed was different, not mocking, but stunned. He began to play a simple melody, a folk tune that felt as old as the mountains, its notes weaving a story of open fields and lonely nights. It was not complex, not flashy, but it was played with a control and feeling that no amateur could muster. The crowd, expecting a clumsy performance, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few leaned forward, their expressions softening as the music took hold. Sarah, still standing by the kitchen, felt her breath catch. The melody reminded her of something her brother used to hum when they were kids, a tune from their grandmother's old records. She clutched her tray tighter, her eyes locked on James. Alexander, however, was undeterred. "Beginner's luck," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Anyone can pluck a few notes and call it music." But his voice lacked its earlier confidence, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The man on the stage, in his tattered coat and scuffed boots, was not supposed to be capable of this. James's fingers moved with a quiet grace, the bow gliding across the strings with a precision that spoke of years, decades of practice. The melody grew not in volume but in emotion, each note carrying a weight of sorrow and resilience. It was the sound of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, but still found a way to sing through the pain. A woman in a silver gown sitting near the front set down her champagne flute, her hand trembling slightly. "What is that song?" she whispered to her companion, who shook his head, equally captivated. The music was unfamiliar, yet it felt universal, as if it were speaking directly to some buried part of their souls. At a table near the back, an older woman named Margaret Ellison, a retired philanthropist with a passion for classical music, tilted her head, her brow furrowing. The melody tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place, something from her youth, perhaps when she had volunteered at a veterans' hospital during the war. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied James's face. Alexander, sensing the shift in the room's mood, climbed down from his chair and strode closer to the stage. His arms crossed tightly. "Keep going," he said, his voice sharp but unsteady. "Let's see how long you can keep up this charade." James didn't acknowledge him. His eyes were half closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. The melody reached a gentle crescendo, then softened, fading into a final haunting note that seemed to hang in the air like mist. When he lowered the violin, the room was silent again, but it was not the silence of mockery. It was the silence of a crowd that had been caught off guard. Their assumptions cracked like thin ice underfoot. Sarah felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, though she quickly blinked it away, aware of Harold's watchful gaze. Margaret Ellison's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a mix of wonder and suspicion. Alexander, however, forced a smile, clapping his hands slowly in exaggerated applause. "Not bad," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But, let's be honest, that was a fluke. Anyone can learn a little ditty like that. Why don't you try something real? Something that proves you're not just a one-trick pony?" James looked at him, his expression unreadable. One song was the deal, he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that made Alexander flinch. But if you want more, I'll play. Name your price. The challenge was subtle, but it landed like a gauntlet thrown at Alexander's feet. The banker's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, turning to the crowd for support. What do you say, folks? Shall we give our guest another chance to entertain us? The crowd murmured, some nodding eagerly, others still processing the unexpected beauty of what they had just heard. Alexander's eyes gleamed with a cruel spark. Fine, he said, stepping closer to the stage. Play something harder, impress us. If you can make it through without embarrassing yourself, I'll make sure you get a full meal, maybe even a doggy bag, to take back to the alley. The crowd laughed, but it was weaker this time, less certain. They were beginning to sense that this man, this stranger in their midst, was not what he seemed. James nodded, almost imperceptibly, and raised the violin again. He adjusted his grip, his fingers finding their place with a familiarity that belied his ragged appearance. He took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the room one last time, taking in the faces of the people who had laughed at him, mocked him, dismissed him. He saw Sarah, her expression a mix of hope and fear. He saw Margaret, her gaze intense and searching. And he saw Alexander standing too close, his arrogance a fragile shield against the growing unease in his gut. James's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a flicker of something knowing, something dangerous. He drew the bow across the strings again, and the first note of his next piece, a single piercing A, cut through the room like a blade, signaling the start of something far greater than anyone, least of all Alexander Reed, could have anticipated. The single piercing note from James Carver's violin lingered in the Aurora Grand Ballroom, a sharp, crystalline sound that seemed to hold the room captive. The chandeliers above cast their fractured light across the polished mahogany floor, but every eye was fixed on the man in the tattered brown coat, his weathered hands steady as they cradled the old violin. The guest, still reeling from the haunting folk melody he had played moments before, sat in a fragile silence, their earlier mockery now tinged with uncertainty. Alexander Reed, the investment banker who had turned James's simple request for a meal into a cruel spectacle, stood near the stage, his arms crossed, his smile a brittle mask. He had expected a clumsy performance, a chance to humiliate the stranger and solidify his own dominance, but that first song had shaken his confidence. The crowd, too, was shifting. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others whispered nervously, sensing the ground beneath their assumptions beginning to crack. James, undeterred by Alexander's taunts, adjusted his stance, his boots scuffing faintly against the stage. He raised the violin again, his pale green eyes sweeping the room, not with defiance, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. "You asked for something harder," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "I'll give you a story instead." The words hung in the air, cryptic and commanding, as he drew the bow across the strings once more. The opening notes of Vivaldi's concerto in a minor spilled from the violin, a cascade of rapid, intricate phrases that danced like sparks in a firestorm. The music was alive, vibrant, and impossibly precise, each note struck with a clarity that made the chandeliers seem dim by comparison. James's fingers moved with a speed and grace that belied his rough appearance, the bow a blur as it wove through the complex allegro. The crowd, expecting another simple tune, gasped audibly, their champagne flutes forgotten in their hands. This was no amateur's performance. It was the work of a master, a musician who knew the soul of the instrument as intimately as his own. Sarah Mitchell. The young waitress standing near the kitchen doors felt her heart race. She had pulled out her phone discreetly recording the performance, her hands trembling as she captured the moment. The music spoke to her in a way she couldn't explain, a mix of joy and sorrow, like a memory of something she had never lived, but somehow understood. She glanced at the hotel manager, Harold Grayson, who was too busy watching James to notice her. His face, usually pinched with anxiety, was slack with awe, his earlier threats forgotten. Alexander Reed, however, was not so easily swayed. He shifted his weight, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, and muttered to the man beside him, "He's just showing off. Probably practiced this one piece his whole life." But his voice lacked conviction, and the man, a hedge fund manager named Thomas Crane, didn't respond. His eyes locked on James. The music was relentless, a whirlwind of notes that seemed to pull the room into its orbit. James's body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his face serene, but focused, as if he were channeling something far greater than himself. The concerto's first movement built to a crescendo, then softened into a delicate, almost tender passage, the violin's voice singing with a warmth that made several guests lean forward, their expressions softening. At a table near the back, Margaret Ellison, the retired philanthropist, gripped the edge of her chair. The music stirred a memory, faint but persistent, of a young man she had seen decades ago playing a violin in a makeshift hospital tent during the war. She whispered to her companion, "I've heard this before. Not Vivaldi, but that touch. It's unmistakable." Her companion, a younger woman in a velvet gown, shook her head confused. "What do you mean?" "Margaret." But Margaret didn't answer, her eyes fixed on James, searching for a connection she couldn't yet name. As the concerto transitioned into its slower second movement, James paused for a fraction of a second, letting the silence hang like a breath before speaking. "This piece," he said, his voice cutting through the hush, "is for a friend I lost a long time ago. He taught me to play when we were young, in a place where music was the only thing that kept us sane." He didn't look at the crowd, his eyes distant, as if seeing a different world. "We were in a camp, far from home, surrounded by mud and fear. He'd play this old battered violin, and for a few minutes we'd forget the bombs. He made me promise to keep playing no matter what." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Even Alexander, who had been ready with another barb, hesitated, his lips parting, but no sound coming out. James began to play again, the slow, mournful notes of the largo weaving a tapestry of loss and memory. The music was a lament, each phrase heavy with the ache of things left unsaid, of promises kept in the face of despair. Sarah, still recording, felt tears well in her eyes. She thought of her brother, who had once played a scratched guitar on their porch, his music a lifeline during their hardest years. She wiped her cheek quickly, hoping no one noticed. The crowd was no longer laughing. The earlier jeers and bets had dissolved into a rapt attention, the kind reserved for something sacred. A man in a navy suit, a surgeon who had made his fortune in cosmetic procedures, set down his fork, his appetite gone. His wife, seated beside him, reached for his hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light, but seeming trivial in the face of the music. The notes were not just beautiful. They were honest, raw, and unapologetic, stripping away the room's veneer of self-importance. James's fingers, which had looked so clumsy and worn when he first entered, now danced across the strings with a precision that was almost otherworldly. He leaned into the music, his body a conduit for the story. He was telling a story of survival, of friendship, of a world where music was a rebellion against despair. Margaret Ellison's hands trembled in her lap. She was certain now this man, this supposed vagrant, was no ordinary musician. She had heard stories during her volunteer days, tales of a young soldier who played the violin in the darkest corners of war, his music a beacon for those who had lost hope. They called him the violinist of Dawn Hill, a name whispered among veterans like a legend. Could this be him? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the music pulled her back, insisting on its truth. Alexander, sensing the room slipping away from him, stepped closer to the stage, his jaw tight. "That's enough storytelling," he called out, his voice sharp but unsteady. "You're here to play, not give us a sob story." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, but others shot him disapproving glances. The music had changed the atmosphere, and Alexander's cruelty was starting to feel out of place. James didn't respond, his bow moving steadily through the concerto's final movement, a presto that erupted with a fiery intensity. The notes were fast, almost frenetic, a storm of sound that seemed to challenge the room itself. It was as if James were daring them to dismiss him now, to call this a fluke or a trick. The violin sang its voice, rising and falling with a passion that made the air feel electric. Sarah's phone trembled in her hands as she recorded her breath, catching at the sheer power of the performance. She knew this video could be something extraordinary, something that could change how people saw this man, this moment. She glanced at Harold, who was now watching with a mix of fear and fascination, his earlier threats forgotten. As the concerto reached its climax, James allowed a flicker of his true skill to shine through a cascade of double stops and trills that required a virtuosity few could achieve. For 10 seconds, he played with the brilliance of a concert hall soloist, the notes a torrent of precision and fire. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the room. A woman in a gold dress clutched her necklace, her eyes wide with disbelief. "My God," she whispered, "he's incredible." Even Thomas Crane, the hedge fund manager who had scoffed earlier, leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. Alexander's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. This was not part of the plan. The man was supposed to fail to be a laughingstock, not to command the room with a talent that made Alexander's wealth feel insignificant. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but the music drowned him out, its intensity rendering his voice powerless. James finished the piece with a single soaring note that hung in the air like a star before fading into silence. The room was still the only sound, the faint hum of the chandeliers above. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, a woman in the front row began to clap her hands, tentative, at first, then stronger. Others joined the applause, growing into a wave that filled the ballroom. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, stopped recording and slipped her phone back into her pocket, her heart pounding. She wanted to run to James to thank him for proving them all wrong, but she stayed rooted, aware of Harold's watchful eyes. Margaret Ellison was on her feet now, her hands clasped together, her face a mix of awe and recognition. She was certain now this was no ordinary man. The stories from her youth, the tales of the violinist of Dawn Hill, were coming to life before her eyes. Alexander, however, was not clapping. He strode to the edge of the stage, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Very nice," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got some skill, I'll give you that. But let's see if you can really move us. Play something that makes us feel something, old man. Make us cry. If you can do that, I'll double the deal, not just a meal, but $2,000 cash." The crowd buzzed, sensing the stakes rising, but there was a new undercurrent now, a tension that hadn't been there before. They were no longer laughing at James. They were waiting to see what he would do next. James lowered the violin, his expression calm but piercing. He looked at Alexander, then at the crowd, his eyes lingering on Sarah for a moment, as if acknowledging her quiet support. "A challenge," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made Alexander take a step back. "I'll take it, but not for the money, for the story." He raised the violin again, his bow poised, and the room held its breath, knowing that whatever came next would be unlike anything they had ever witnessed. The music had already begun to unravel their certainties, and James Carver, the man they had dismissed as a vagrant, was about to show them just how wrong they had been. The Aurora Grand Ballroom in Seattle hung in a tense electric silence as James Carver stood on the stage, his old violin resting against his shoulder. The final notes of Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor still echoed in the minds of the 200 guests, their earlier mockery replaced by a stunned reverence. The man they had dismissed as a vagrant had just played with a mastery that rivaled the world's finest musicians, his fingers weaving a story of loss and resilience that left the room breathless. Alexander Reed, the investment banker who had turned James's plea for a meal into a public humiliation, stood at the edge of the stage, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, and a growing dread that he was losing control. The crowd, once his obedient audience, now watched James with a mix of awe and curiosity, their champagne flutes forgotten, their laughter silenced. Sarah Mitchell, the young waitress who had secretly recorded James's performance, stood near the kitchen doors, her heart pounding as she clutched her phone. She felt a connection to this man, a stranger whose music spoke to her own struggles and dreams. Margaret Ellison, the retired philanthropist seated near the back, was trembling, her mind racing with memories of a wartime legend known as the violinist of Dawn Hill. The air was thick with anticipation as James met Alexander's challenge to play something that would make the room cry with a promise of $2,000 if he succeeded. But James's calm, piercing gaze suggested he was playing for something far greater than money. "You want tears?" James said, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "I'll give you more than that. I'll give you truth." He raised the violin, his calloused fingers finding their place with a familiarity that made the instrument seem like an extension of his soul. The crowd leaned forward, their earlier cynicism crumbling under the weight of his presence. Alexander, his arms crossed tightly, forced a smirk, but it was brittle, a shield against the unease gnawing at him. "Go on, then," he said, his voice sharp but unsteady. "Let's see if you can back up that big talk, old man." James ignored him, his eyes closing for a moment as he drew a slow breath. When he opened them, his gaze was distant, as if he were looking through the glittering ballroom to a place far beyond its gilded walls. He began to play the first notes of Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings arranged for solo violin, emerging soft and mournful like a whisper from a forgotten world. The melody was achingly simple, each note heavy with a sorrow so profound it seemed to pull the air from the room. It was the sound of grief, of longing, of a heart that had seen too much but refused to break. The music wove its way through the ballroom, a slow, deliberate tide that washed over every guest. Sarah felt her breath catch, tears welling in her eyes, as the notes stirred memories of her brother's darkest days, when she had sat by his side in a halfway house praying he'd find his way back. She glanced at her phone, the recording still running, capturing every haunting phrase. The Adagio was not just music. It was a confession, a lament for all the things lost to time, friends, dreams, innocence. James's bow moved with a tenderness that was almost unbearable, each stroke drawing out a sound so pure it felt like a prayer. The crowd, so used to hiding their emotions behind wealth and status, began to crack. A woman in a sapphire gown pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she fought back a sob. A man in a pinstripe suit, who had earlier bet James couldn't play a scale, stared at his hands, his face pale, as if seeing his own emptiness reflected in the music. Margaret Ellison's eyes were wet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was certain now this was the violinist of Dawn Hill, the soldier whose music had brought light to the darkest corners of war. She whispered to her companion, "It's him. It has to be him." James's playing grew in intensity, the adagio building to a wrenching climax that felt like a cry from the soul. The notes were no longer just sound. They were a mirror, forcing each guest to confront their own fragility, their own hidden pain. A man in the front row, a tech mogul, who prided himself on his stoicism, wiped a tear from his cheek, his hand trembling. Another guest, a socialite dripping in diamonds, let out a soft, involuntary sob, her mascara streaking. Even Harold Grayson, the nervous hotel manager, stood frozen, his usual fussiness replaced by a quiet awe. Sarah, unable to hold back any longer, let her tears fall freely, her phone shaking in her hands as she recorded. The music was a bridge between James and the crowd, connecting them in a way they hadn't expected, stripping away their defenses. Alexander, however, was unraveling. He paced at the edge of the stage, his face a mask of panic. This was not supposed to happen. The man was meant to be a joke, a fleeting amusement, not a force that could command the emotions of an entire room. He opened his mouth to interrupt, to reclaim control, but the music drowned him out, its power rendering him insignificant. As the adagio reached its peak, James allowed a moment of raw virtuosity to shine through a series of high, piercing notes that trembled with such intensity they seemed to shake the chandeliers. For a brief, breathtaking moment he played with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose, the violin crying out in a voice that was both beautiful and devastating. The crowd gasped, some clutching their chests, others openly weeping. Margaret Ellison was on her feet now, her hands pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She remembered the stories from the Veterans Hospital of a young soldier who played for the wounded, his music a lifeline in the chaos of war. They said he had volunteered for a doomed mission at Dawn Hill, drawing enemy fire to save his unit, and was presumed dead. Yet here he was alive, his music as powerful now as it had been then. Sarah, too, was overcome, her tears blurring the screen of her phone. She thought of her brother, of the nights she'd hummed to him to keep his demons at bay, and she knew this video would be more than a recording. It would be a testament to a man who had turned pain into beauty. James brought the piece to a close, the final notes fading into a silence so profound it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. He lowered the violin, his shoulders rising and falling with steady breaths, his face calm but intense. The crowd was still, their faces a mosaic of awe, shame, and something deeper recognition of a truth they had tried to ignore. Alexander, his composure shattered, stepped forward, his voice hoarse. That's not possible," he stammered, his eyes darting from James to the crowd. "You can't. You're just a nobody. This is a trick." But his words fell flat, drowned by the weight of what they had just witnessed. The applause began slowly, a single pair of hands near the back, then another, until the room erupted in a wave of clapping that was less about celebration and more about acknowledgement, a collective admission that they had been wrong. Sarah stopped her recording, her hands shaking, as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. She wanted to run to James to thank him, but she stayed rooted, her eyes locked on his figure. Margaret Ellison approached the stage, her steps slow but deliberate, her face a mix of reverence and disbelief. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't just skill. That was something divine." James looked at her, his expression softening for the first time that evening. "Here and there, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but cryptic. "My father taught me the basics. The war taught me the rest." The answer was vague, yet heavy with truth. His father had indeed shown him his first notes on a borrowed violin, but it was in the refugee camps and battlefields playing for those who had lost everything that he had learned what music could do. Margaret's eyes widened, the pieces clicking into place. "The violinist of Dawn Hill?" she whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They said you were dead." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the name sparking recognition in a few older guests who had heard the legend, a soldier whose music had been a beacon of hope, a hero who had vanished after a suicidal mission. Alexander, his face pale, seized the moment to regain control. "Enough of this!" he shouted, climbing onto the stage, his voice raw with desperation. "You've had your fun, old man. You played your little song and you got your tears fine. I'll give you your $2,000, and you can crawl back to whatever hole you came from." He pulled out his wallet, fumbling with a stack of bills, his hands shaking with a mix of rage and humiliation. The crowd watched their earlier amusement replaced by discomfort. Alexander's cruelty, once a source of entertainment, now felt petty, even shameful. James didn't move to take the money. Instead, he looked at Alexander, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I didn't play for your money," he said, his voice cutting through the banker's bluster. "I played to see who you are. And I've seen enough." The words were a quiet rebuke, but they landed like a thunderclap, silencing Alexander and drawing gasps from the crowd. James set the violin back in its case, his movements deliberate, then turned to face the room. "You're all here tonight for a cause," he said, his voice rising with a newfound authority. "A center for orphaned children, a place to give them hope, a future. A noble goal funded by a $7 million donation from an anonymous benefactor." He paused, letting the words sink in. The crowd stirred the mysterious donor, a topic of gossip for months. Alexander's eyes narrowed, a horrifying suspicion dawning. James continued, his voice steady but sharp. "I came here tonight to see if the people running this cause were worthy of it. I came to meet the chairman, to look him in the eye, to see his heart. And what I found—" He looked directly at Alexander, his gaze unyielding. "What I found was a man who sees a hungry stranger and chooses cruelty over compassion, who turns a plea for help into a game for his own amusement." The room was deathly silent, every guest hanging on James's words. Sarah's heart raced, her hands clasped tightly as she realized what was happening. Margaret Ellison stepped closer, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "You're him," she said, her voice breaking. "The violinist of Dawn Hill. You're the donor, aren't you?" James gave a slight nod, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I've been fortunate since the war," he said simply. "I built a business, made a life. But I never forgot the ones who didn't make it back, the ones who needed help. When I heard about this center, I wanted to make sure it was in the right hands." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. The man they had mocked, the man they had called a nobody, was their benefactor, the reason they were all here. Alexander's face drained of color, his wallet slipping from his hand, the bills scattering across the stage like leaves in a storm. The truth was undeniable, and it was devastating. James's eyes swept the crowd, his voice softening, but no less powerful. "I played tonight not just to win a meal, but to remind you that worth isn't measured by wealth or status. It's measured by what you do when you think no one's watching." He looked at Sarah, his expression warm. "And I saw some of you watching with kindness, even when it cost you." Sarah's breath caught her tears falling anew as she realized he had noticed her. The crowd was silent, their shame a tangible weight. Alexander, his world crumbling, stammered, This can't be true. You're lying." But no one believed him. The music, the truth, had stripped him bare. James picked up his violin case, his posture tall and commanding, no longer the hunched figure who had entered the ballroom. He had set the stage for the final act, and the room now, his captive audience, waited to see what he would do next. The Aurora Grand Ballroom in Seattle was cloaked in a silence so profound it seemed to pulse with the weight of James Carver's revelation. The man in the tattered brown coat who had entered as a supposed vagrant had just unmasked himself as the violinist of Dawn Hill, a war hero and the anonymous donor of $7 million for the Children's Hope Center. His music, a haunting folk tune, a fiery Vivaldi concerto, and the soul-wrenching adagio for strings had shattered the smug certainty of the city's elite, leaving them humbled and exposed. Alexander Reed, the investment banker who had mocked James and turned his plea for a meal into a cruel game, stood frozen on the stage, his face ashen, the scattered $2,000 in bills at his feet, a mocking reminder of his failed wager. The 200 guests, their glittering gowns and tailored suits now seeming garish, sat in stunned silence, their earlier laughter replaced by a collective shame. Sarah Mitchell, the young waitress who had recorded James's performance, stood near the kitchen doors. Tears streaming down her face, her phone heavy with the video that captured a moment of truth. Margaret Ellison, the retired philanthropist who had recognized James as a legend, was on her feet, her eyes shining with awe and respect. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired, and James, standing tall with his violin case in hand, was about to deliver the final movement of his lesson, a lesson that would echo far beyond this gilded room. James stepped forward, his boots echoing softly on the stage, his posture no longer that of a weary beggar, but of a man who had seen the world's darkness and chosen to fight it with light. His pale green eyes swept the room, holding every gaze with a quiet authority that made even the most hardened guests look away. Tonight, he began, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the ballroom like a bell. You came here to celebrate a cause, to build a home for children who have lost everything. You wrote checks, you drank champagne, you patted yourselves on the back. But when a stranger stood before you, asking for nothing but a chance to prove his worth, you laughed. You judged. You saw only the coat, the dirt, the story you told yourselves about who I must be. His words were not angry, but they cut deep, each one a mirror reflecting the crowd's failures. Alexander flinched, his hands clenching into fists, but he said nothing, his earlier bravado reduced to ash. James continued, his voice softening, but no less powerful. I didn't come here to shame you. I came to see if this cause, this center, was in hands that could be trusted. I came to see if you could look beyond the surface and find the humanity underneath. He turned his gaze to Alexander, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. Mr. Reed, James said, his tone as cold and unyielding as steel. You stood here tonight and called me a nobody, a failure, a man worth less than the dust on my boots. You made a game of my hunger, a spectacle of my supposed worthlessness. You showed me exactly who you are, a man who measures worth by wealth, who sees compassion as weakness. You are not fit to lead this cause. The words landed like a verdict, final and irrevocable. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock passing through the room. Alexander's face contorted a mix of rage and humiliation, but he could find no words to defend himself. The truth of James's judgment was written in the faces of the guests, who looked at Alexander not with sympathy, but with condemnation. Effective immediately, James continued, his voice ringing with authority. "You are removed as chairman of the Children's Hope Center Fundraising Committee. Your presence is no longer needed here tonight." The finality of the statement was crushing, and Alexander, his world unraveling, stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly for an ally, but finding none. With a strangled sound, he turned and fled toward the grand archway, the crowd parting to let him pass his tailored suit, now a hollow shell. The room watched him go, and a quiet applause began, not for his departure, but for the justice of James's words. James let the applause fade, raising a hand for silence. He turned to the crowd, his expression softening, as he sought out Sarah Mitchell, the young waitress who had shown him kindness when no one else would. "Sarah," he called gently, beckoning her forward. She hesitated, her black and white uniform stark against the sea of silk and sequins, then walked to the stage, her steps tentative, her face flushed with emotion. The crowd watched, curious, as she stopped before James, her hands clasped nervously. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice warm and paternal, "I saw you tonight. When everyone else was laughing, you looked at me with compassion. You started to step forward, risking your job to offer a stranger a moment of dignity. That is the kind of heart this center needs." Sarah's eyes widened, tears spilling over as she shook her head, overwhelmed. "Sir, I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You did everything." James replied, his smile genuine and kind. "You're studying social work, aren't you, to help those who've been forgotten?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "Consider your tuition and student loans paid in full starting tomorrow," James said, his voice firm but gentle. "And when you graduate, I'd be honored if you'd accept a position as Director of Community Outreach for the Children's Hope Center. We need people like you, people who see the person, not the circumstances." The crowd erupted in applause, louder this time, a wave of approval that washed over Sarah, who covered her mouth, sobbing openly now. She had come to work expecting to serve drinks and clear plates, but she was leaving with her future transformed, a reward for a single act of decency that had not gone unnoticed. James reached down to the stage, gathering the scattered $2,000 that Alexander had thrown in his desperation. He pressed the bills into Sarah's trembling hands. "This is yours," he said softly. "You and Mrs. Ellison proved Mr. Reed wrong. You proved that humanity still lives in this room." Sarah clutched the money, her tears falling onto the bills, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. She looked at James, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." James squeezed her hand gently. "Say you'll keep being who you are," he said. "That's enough." He turned to Margaret Ellison, who had approached the stage, her eyes still glistening with tears. "Bess." "Ellison James," said, his voice filled with respect, "you've spent your life building things that matter. Hospitals, schools, programs for those in need. Tonight, you were the first to see me as more than a problem, to recognize the music for what it was. You know what it means to value integrity over appearance." Margaret nodded, her expression a mix of pride and humility. "I've heard stories of you, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "The violinist of Dawn Hill. Your music saved lives then, and it's saving lives now." James inclined his head, acknowledging her words. "The Children's Hope Center needs a new chairman, he said. Someone with a heart for service, not status. I can think of no one better than you. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, her eyes widening. Mr. Carver, I'm honored, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll do my best to make this center a place of hope, as you intended. The crowd applauded again, the sound warm and genuine, a testament to the shift in their perspective. James stepped back, his violin case in hand, and addressed the room one final time. Look around you, he said, his voice commanding but not harsh. Tonight, you saw a man in rags and judged him worthless. You saw a man in a fine suit and followed him blindly. You were wrong on both counts. True worth lies in what you do when you think no one's watching, in the kindness you show when it costs you something, in the courage to stand up for what's right. His eyes found Harold Grayson, the hotel manager who had been cowering near the kitchen, his face slick with sweat. Harold started forward, stammering, Mr. Carver. Sir, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. But James silenced him with a look, not cruel but piercing, a look that saw through Harold's cowardice and deference to wealth. Harold wilted, his apologies dying in his throat, and James turned away, his message clear. As he walked toward the grand archway, the crowd parted their silence, a mixture of respect and reverence. James paused at the edge of the room, turning back one last time. This center isn't just a building, he said. It's a promise to children who've lost their families, their homes, their hope. Make sure it's a promise kept. With that, he stepped through the archway and into the night, leaving behind a room forever changed. The guests sat in silence, their wealth and status suddenly feeling small in the face of James's truth. Sarah, still clutching the $2,000, felt a fire ignite within her, a determination to honor James's faith in her. Margaret, already planning her first steps as chairman, felt a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by a man who had turned his pain into a legacy. In the days that followed, Sarah's video of James's performance went viral, shared across social media, with captions like, "The violinist who silenced a room and a hero's lesson in compassion." The story of that night became a legend in Seattle, a cautionary tale for the arrogant and a beacon for the kind. The Children's Hope Center opened 6 months later, with Margaret at the helm and Sarah leading outreach, their work transforming lives, one child at a time. The ballroom's grand violin, though silent, now stood as a witness to the night. A single man's music had dismantled a world of prejudice and rebuilt it with hope. The lesson was clear. Worth is not in the clothes you wear or the money you have, but in the heart you show, the courage you summon, and the compassion you give when it matters most. James Carver, the violinist of Dawn Hill, had not just played for a meal, he had played for a truth that would echo through the city, inspiring all who heard it to look deeper, to see better, and to be more.